All right. So maybe let's wait a couple of minutes to let people join. All right, so it seems people are trickling in. Let's start this off. Welcome to today's e-Axis webinar for young economists on climate, finance, and economics. My name is Diego Kanzig. I'm here at Northwestern University. This is the second webinar in our series. Previously, we had Thomas Tuomonen from Boston College, who presented his very interesting work on heat stress. You can watch the previous webinars on the e-Axis Forum website. But today, we are very excited to welcome Ishan Nath, who will present his paper titled, "How Much Will Global Warming Cool Global Growth?" So Ishan is an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, working on topics related to climate change, growth, trade, and development. Prior to joining the Fed, Ishan did his PhD at the University of Chicago and then also held postdoctoral positions also at the Climate Impact Lab in Chicago and also Princeton University. So we're very excited to have you, Ishan. Before we get into the presentation, we have a little poll that relates to the topic of today. So Anushka, could you maybe open the questions? All right. So I'll give you a couple of minutes, the attendees, to complete the poll, and then we will jump right into the paper. All right, so poll closed. Now we should soon be able to see the results. Okay, so on the first question, which of the following is likely to be the case about the effects of rising temperatures on GDP across countries? The large majority of attendees chose the first answer, that the effects on temperature differ markedly by country. Some countries may lose substantially from warming, whereas others gain moderately, and some experience little to no effect. And on the second question, the projected increases in temperature from unabated global warming are likely to have what type of effect on aggregate output in countries throughout the world? There, the majority, namely 57%, replied that countries experience permanent effects of temperature on GDP growth, such that their incomes become increasingly divergent over time. So pretty bleak. This motivates the fact that we have to do something about global warming. And with that, happy to give Ishan the floor, and we will learn more about the likely impacts of climate change on growth. Thanks so much, Ishan, for making it.
Cool. Wait, can people see my screen? I can't tell.
We can see your screen, yeah.
Okay, cool. Are we going to do the poll again at the end to see whether I convince people to take the view of this paper? No, that's too much pressure. Then what if everyone still believes something different than what this paper says? Okay, great. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me. This is a paper, How Much Will Global Warming Cool Global Growth? It's still somewhat preliminary work. We're I think on the verge of releasing the draft soon. So we're excited to get feedback and comments. This is a paper with Pete at Stanford and Valerie at UC San Diego, and I'm excited to work with them. Okay, so the research question here is fairly obvious from the title. We're just trying to project the impacts of global warming on the global economy at the country level. And what we have right now, basically in this literature, is like two really divergent sets of estimates that people have used in the past. The first and kind of original, most prominent, going back to the Nobel Prize winning work from Bill Nordhaus, but also work from a lot of others, suggests like these really modest impacts of warming on the global economy, like several degrees of warming, and you lose only about a couple percentage points of output. And then in contrast, there's some more recent empirical work published in Nature in 2015 that suggests about an order of magnitude larger of an impact on the global economy. So 20-some% instead of 2 or 3%. And in the hottest and coldest countries, these more recent estimates differ even more from kind of the previously standard set of estimates. Okay. And of course, when you have estimates that diverge so tremendously, that's going to filter through the entire climate change economics literature and even beyond academia. So all sorts of papers in academic macro use these damage estimates in analyses of lots of different policy questions. There are social cost of carbon estimates in the science literature and used by governments and policy institutions that rely on these damage estimates. If you kind of pick up the popular press and read about the future impacts of climate change, very frequently underneath the article you're reading, they're referring to one of these sets of estimates. And again, they differ really tremendously, and that's going to filter through kind of the whole conversation that we have about climate change. Okay, so why do these estimates differ so much? Basically, you kind of got this already from the poll, but the question here that we're really trying to go after in this paper is, should we model the effects of permanent temperature change as a level effect or a growth effect on the economy? So just to make sure we're all on the same page and talking about the same thing, I just put up this example graph of how these two versions of the projections would differ. Suppose you have a permanent change in temperature that starts in year 0. The blue line is the no climate change baseline trajectory of log GDP per capita. The green line is what you get if you project just a level effect. Temperature in each year knocks down output a little bit in that year, but there's no accumulation over time. You only have to know what the temperature was in a given year to know what output was in that year. It's just the level effects. There's nothing happening to the growth rate. Then in contrast, the red line is what if the growth rate was lower every year permanently into the future. So that's what, and when you model it that way, you're going to get kind of this permanently increasing impacts of climate change based on all of the years of temperature shocks, temperature change that have accumulated. So of course, when you project the green line and the red line out over a whole century, you're going to get really, really different estimates. Just to give you a sense, again, of how different the estimates are depending on this assumption about the projections, this is an example of what you get for the impact of temperature change on the country level economy around the world using the level effect estimates. So in kind of the hardest hit countries, you get something like 6, 7, 8% losses, and overall for the world, you get a couple percentage point losses from several degrees of warming if you do level effects. And then on the same color scale, these are the estimates from projecting using the permanent growth effect. So instead of 6 or 7 or 8% in the hardest hit countries, you get 80 or 90 or 95% in the hardest hit countries. And overall for the world, you get something like 20 to 30%. So this is what we have in the literature right now, is kind of these two choices, and they diverge like really dramatically. And so that's kind of the research question we're trying to explore here. Okay, so how do people come to such different conclusions about how to project the effects of temperature change? There's a variety of papers in this literature that have been written, and the debate primarily right now focuses on an empirical question about what we see in the past record of largely transitory temperature shocks that we can estimate the effects of using data from what countries have already experienced. And so basically the debate in this literature is, do the effects of a temporary temperature shock in year 0 look more like the green line or the red line? So the green line here says, suppose you're moving along in your economy and you have a temperature shock in year 0 that's temporary. It's a bad year when you have this temperature shock, but then the economy bounces right back and you go right back to normal after this temporary shock. In contrast, the red line suggests a permanent level effect from a temporary temperature shock. So you get hit once with the shock in year 0, but then the economy doesn't recover and you stay permanently down after that. So the debate right now is largely an empirical debate about which of these two lines looks closer to the truth in the data. And then that maps into whether you should project a permanent shock as a permanent level effect or a permanent growth effect. So if you think temperature matters only in that year, and the green line is the truth, then you're going to want to project a level effect of a permanent temperature change, because in every year, only that year's temperature matters. There's no accumulation over time. In contrast, if you think that the red line is the truth, that for a temporary shock, then you want to project the effects of a permanent shock as a permanent growth effect. In year 0, you have temperatures elevated in year 0. That's going to affect all future years in the future. Now, in year 1, if temperature is still elevated, you have to account for the year 0 effect that's still there and the new effect of temperature being elevated in year 1. So you're going to be down here. Then in year 2, you have year 0 and year 1's effects that are still hitting the economy. You have a new effect, so you're going to be down here. And the red line is going to suggest that for a permanent shock, you're going to want to project permanent divergence of growth rates. What we're going to suggest in this paper, using a variety of theory and evidence, is that we think the quote unquote right way, or the way we're arguing for projecting these sorts of changes, is going to look more like the orange line, somewhere in between, where we allow temperature change, where temporary shocks have a persistent but not a permanent impact on temperature levels, which is going to suggest that a permanent impact, a permanent change in temperature, is going to have a persistent but not a permanent effect on economic growth. That's going to give you something that's a lot bigger of an estimate than the green line, but a lot smaller of an estimate than the red line. Okay, so how do we make this case in this paper? We start with theory and some empirical evidence for why we don't think it's likely that countries are going to experience permanently diverging growth rates. So I guess the poll question here suggests that bullet point 1 is going to be controversial with this audience, so I'll try to spend some time on that. But this is just going to be like some of the simplest macro growth theory we can write down as a lens to interpret empirical evidence that suggests that country growth rates are tethered together by knowledge spillovers and technology flows across countries, such that it's unlikely that the effects of global warming are going to be so different in different parts of the world that they permanently grow in opposite directions. So we start by making that case. And then we're going to have some of our own empirical estimates of the temperature GDP relationship. And then we're going to use the empirical estimates informed by what we saw from the theory and the evidence on growth to make our own set of projections of future climate change impacts. Okay, I kind of already gave you a little bit of the results preview, but in the first part of the paper, we're going to present this evidence that suggests that growth is linked across countries, which is going to want us not to model these temperature changes as permanent country-specific growth effects. When viewing this evidence through the lens of the model, it's going to suggest that a temporary temperature shock is going to have these persistent but not permanent effects on GDP, which suggests that a permanent change in temperature is going to lead to a medium run and potentially quite a long run growth effect, but not a permanent growth effect. So we're going to try to thread the needle in this paper where we say that when you're talking about 100 years or over 100 years, the difference between a 10 or 20-year growth effect and a permanent growth effect is actually going to be a huge difference. So in our projections, we are going to allow temperature to have a pretty long run growth effect, but that's going to give you something that's really different than a permanent growth effect because of the lengths of time that we're talking about. Okay, so that's the model part of the paper. Then we have our new panel estimates using kind of the time series methods that Valerie is an expert on. And these panel estimates show these large and very persistent impacts of temperature on GDP. And so in some sense, our empirical estimates are going to be closer to the red line than the green line in that graph I showed you. We're finding like tremendous amounts of persistence in the impacts of temperature on GDP. Although we also find that some of that is driven by persistence in temperature shocks themselves in hot countries. So some of the persistence in GDP is coming from the fact that it's actually not purely a temporary shock that we're looking at in the historical record, and that's going to account for a bit of it. But largely, we're finding that these primarily transitory shocks are having these very long-term effects, suggesting that that we might expect a permanent change in temperature, which of course we can't get quasi-experimental evidence on, but a hypothetical permanent change in temperature we would think would likely have a pretty long-term effect on the growth rate, although in our projections we don't allow it to be permanent. So in our projections, we're going to get something that's about 3 to 5 times larger than what you get when you make the level effect projections, and about 3 or 4 times smaller than what you get from the permanent growth effect projections. And that's again because we're allowing for a lot of persistence in the impacts of temperature on GDP, but not the amount of persistence as to where the growth rate is forever different. So on the same color scale as those two maps I showed you, this is where I'm going to end this talk and what our projections are going to look like. So we're finding that for the hardest hit countries, several degrees of warming are going to knock down GDP by about 30%, whereas the level effect projections are finding something like 7 or 8%, and the permanent growth effect projections find something more like 80 or 90%. Okay, there's a ton of things in the climate literature that we're not touching in this paper, so obligatory caveat, there's many other things about climate change. Mike and Diego have written many papers on climate change that are excellent papers, and we're not handling everything in this paper, just level versus growth effects. Okay, and I have a literature slide that I don't have time for, but we can come back to in the Q&A. Okay, so to start with, we just want to write down the simplest possible model of global growth, just as a lens through which to interpret some empirical evidence on whether we think the countries are growing in a purely independent way or in a somewhat dependent way that suggests their growth rates are linked together. Okay, so we're going to write down this simple model that I'll cover just in a couple slides in the talk. And it's really more of a toy model, a stylized model. We're not estimating this model or anything. It's a lens through which to interpret the evidence. So in this model of global growth, domestic production in all the countries is going to draw on a combination of domestic and international technologies. And countries in the long run are going to grow at the same rate. They're going to have these parallel TFP growth paths in steady state, though their levels of TFP and of income can differ permanently in steady state. And the speed of convergence to that steady state is going to depend on how much knowledge and technology spills over across countries. So the steady state is a very long run phenomenon. And in the transition, when some countries are catching up to maybe the steady state growth rate or coming back to the steady state growth rate, how quickly they do so is going to depend on how much growth is interlinked across countries. But importantly, the countries can only permanently diverge in growth paths if there are no dependencies whatsoever in their growth rates. That is, if each country's technology depends only on that country's knowledge and that country's innovation, that's the only way, in kind of the simplest possible growth model from this literature, that you can get the countries growing permanently apart. So each country is an island unto themselves. Then you can get different growth rates in different countries permanently into the future. But if there's some dependencies, this model is going to suggest that in the long run, the growth rates across countries are tethered together. So just to show you the couple key equations in this stylized model, this is Q is the technology in country I in year T. And what it's going to depend on is that country's, mu is that country's ability to adopt technology. So this is like institutions, human capital, whatever you think matters for economic productivity in that country, that goes into the mu. Temperature could go into mu. Sigma is just the elasticity of substitution. That's not super important for this talk. And then critically, the technology realized in country I in year T is going to depend on the technologies available in year T-1 when that country is doing their innovations. And that's going to be a combination of the country's own technologies, that's this Q, that's their own Q in the previous year, and the frontier technologies in the world, that's this Q star. And the importance of the frontier technologies in the world relative to your own technologies are going to depend on this critical spillover parameter omega. So if omega equals 0, the world frontier contributes nothing to domestic technology and domestic growth. Each country's technology depends only on their own path of technology over time and their ability to innovate, their mu. But if omega is greater than 0, then the world frontier is going to filter through into domestic technology to some degree, and there'll be some interdependencies across countries. Okay, so in this model, there's a steady state growth rate that's the same across all countries, which this G star, that's going to depend on the adoption efficiencies, or basically the technological parameter of all of the frontier countries. And you can define frontier however you want in this model, but basically the idea is there are some countries innovating technologies. The innovation rate of aggregate global technology drives global growth, and the degree to which each country is able to benefit from those global technologies depends on their own adoption efficiency, their mu. But in the long run, in this model, as long as that omega, the dependency across countries, is greater than 0, this mu is just going to be a level effect in the long run. It can be a very large level effect. The model can sustain that some countries look like Sweden and some countries look like India in per capita GDP, But over the course of many decades, it suggests that their growth rates are going to tend to be tethered together because they're all drawing, at least to some degree, on this common parameter mu. Now, on this common technology, common pool of technology through that omega parameter. And now critically, the speed of convergence could be really slow if omega is closer to 0, whereas if omega is closer to 1, the speed of convergence might be really fast. And that's going to be something important that I'm going to come back to in our empirical estimates. Okay, so we allow country technology, we allow temperature shocks to affect this mu. So in principle, we're giving temperature the ability to affect growth. And it could be the case that if this parameter omega is 0, it could be the case that these mu's do result in permanent growth effects at the country level. Okay, so now we can look at our impulse response functions, our example impulse response functions from the introduction through the lens of this model. And in this model, what it's going to say is, if omega equals 0, that is each country is an island unto themselves, then if you have a temporary shock in year 0, you never recover because there's nothing pulling you back to any kind of global technology frontier. And in contrast, if you only depend on global technology, then a temporary shock is going to have only a temporary effect. If omega equals 1, you'll bounce back right away. And if omega is somewhere in between, that's going to affect the speed of convergence back to the path you would have been on without the temporary shock. And then in the long run, when we're projecting the effects of a permanent shock, again, like the introduction, these temporary shocks are going to map into, if you never recover from a temporary shock, then a permanent shock is going to permanently impact growth. That's the omega equals 0 case. If you recover immediately, then a permanent shock will have only a level effect. And if you recover slowly from a temporary shock, then you'll have some medium run effect on growth from a permanent change in temperature. That'll eventually map into a larger level effect from that permanent change in temperature than if you had only modeled the level effect. Okay, so now the key question is, what is this omega? Is it greater than 0? Are there some dependencies in growth across countries? And that's where we try to bring in a variety of empirical evidence. I'm not going to have time to cover this in full detail in this talk, but it's worth noting there's a very large literature on technology flows across countries, and so we're not starting from scratch here. We're building upon the work of many other papers that suggest that there's a lot of dependencies in global growth across countries. The differences in growth are transitory. The countries appear to be converging towards, but not surpassing this global frontier. Okay, so there's a lot of other research to draw on. But we're basically in the paper going to make this 3-part case that we think growth is tethered together across countries. So I'm going to just give you a flavor of the 3 parts of our argument here. So the first part of the case is that innovations at the country level do not seem to map into growth at the country level. And so here in the long run, and so here all I'm showing you is that the countries with more researchers, the larger economies that are in the global frontier, they tend to have more patents, and you can do this with other measures of technological innovation. You can importance weight the patents, et cetera. Some countries are innovating a lot more than others among the global frontier. But over the last several decades, all these countries are growing at about the same rate. The ones that are innovating more are not growing faster in the long run, and their levels of income are also not necessarily related to that in the long run. So that's our first piece of evidence that the frontier countries are growing at about the same rate, even though some of them innovate more. Of course, in this model and in kind of most of the frontier growth models in the literature, growth depends on innovation. But you can also do this with a variety of other measures of investment rates, of human capital. It's not the case that country growth rates seem to be, among these frontier countries, seem to be really correlated with any of these factors, which to us suggests that these innovations are spilling over across borders. Okay, so now the second part of our 3-part case that we think the countries are not growing independently is we're just going to look very simply at the persistence of country level differences in growth rates and in growth levels. So all we're going to do is take a panel of countries and regress 2 different Y variables, either the level of TFP or the growth rate of TFP on just a country fixed effect and a year fixed effect. And what we're going to do is we're going to see, can you reject that the country fixed effect is different than the global average for levels and for GDP growth rates over time. And so this is basically asking, does it seem to be the case that growth is a country-specific process that is permanently different across countries? If that's the case, then we should be able to reject that each country's growth rate over a long-term panel is equal to the global average. And the same thing for levels. Okay, so when we do that, these are the results we get. The top panel here shows you this very simple regression of the log level of TFP on just a time fixed effect and a country fixed effect. So we're picking up global growth. We're picking up global levels of TFP over time, and we're saying are countries persistently different from the global average in their level of TFP. And what we find is that the average p-value is fairly low, and for a large majority of countries, we can reject that they're the same as the global average level of TFP over time. That this will make sense that for many countries that are poorer in the historical sample, many of them remain poorer. Countries that are richer remain richer, and so for many of the countries, we can reject at the 5% level. For well over half the countries, that their levels of TFP are persistently different than the global average. But when we do this same exercise for growth rates, there are very, very few countries for which we can reject that their growth rate permanently over time is different than the global average. That is to suggest that the countries that grow faster for a while tend to grow slower in the future, and vice versa on average, such that when you regress the country level growth rate on this country fixed effect and a time fixed effect, it's very difficult to reject that the countries are growing together. And so we basically find that persistence, there's a lot of persistence in differences in levels of TFP, but there's very little persistence in differences in growth rates. So we take this as evidence consistent with this pattern in which, consistent with this model in which the countries follow a common growth process, but can differ in their long run levels of TFP. Okay, I'm gonna largely skip the third piece of evidence just for time reasons, but the third piece of evidence is basically that changes in TFP of the global frontier seem to be able to predict to some degree changes in TFP in given countries. If you just take the equation of motion for technology from our stylized model and use it to motivate a regression where you just regress country TFP in year T on their own lag of TFP and the lag of TFP from the OECD, you can reject strongly that the OECD is not predicting TFP levels outside the OECD. So this column here is basically showing that with like a t-stat of 5, lagged TFP in the OECD predicts TFP in non-OECD countries, suggesting that there's some spillovers, or at least it's evidence consistent with there being some spillovers of technology across countries. Although it's worth noting, and I'm going to come back to this when I show the temperature empirical estimates, the implied omega from taking our equation of motion for technology in the model to the data, the implied omega is very statistically significantly not 0, but it's also very far from 1. And so these omegas that the data suggests you can infer from this equation are about 0.06 or 0.07. So what that means is that through the lens of the model, domestic factors matter tremendously for domestic growth. But they're just not everything. And so we're really trying to thread the needle where we're saying a domestic permanent shock can have a very long run impact on growth, but it's unlikely to be a permanent impact because for that, you would need these omegas to be exactly 0. Okay, so that's kind of a quick tour of that part of the paper. We have this kind of multifaceted empirical evidence case where we argue that this omega is unlikely to be exactly 0, that the countries are growing in permanently independent ways. Our evidence for that is kind of these 3 parts. The rich countries grow at similar rates despite their domestic differences. Income levels differences persist across countries, but growth differences don't. And then third, lagged frontier country TFP tends to predict non-frontier country TFP at least a little bit, suggesting there's at least some degree of spillovers. Okay, so that's the first part of the paper in which we think basically it's really hard to rule out the permanent growth effects from the temperature regressions that I'm about to show you themselves, because there's so much persistence in the impacts of temperature. So that's why we wrote down this stylized model and brought in this variety of kind of non-temperature related empirical evidence, is because we think there's so much persistence in the data that it's really hard to determine whether we should be modeling permanent growth effects or not, just from looking at the temperature regressions, and we think we need to appeal to a variety of outside evidence that I started off by showing you. So that we think the evidence kind of rules out that we should be modeling temperature changes, these permanent country-specific growth effects, but it doesn't rule out that there could be very long-run growth effects. And so to figure out how much persistence there is, we're now going to look at the data on temperature shocks themselves and the historical record, and apply some of kind of the time series methods that some of the people on this team are experts on. Although I do not claim to be one of those experts. Diego's one of those experts, so he can tell us what he thinks about the time series methods. Okay, so there's a variety of past literature running similar temperature regressions, and we think that this builds on that in various ways by combining features that some of the previous work has accounted for, and by adding some new features. And so these are some of the considerations that we think are important in this paper that haven't been fully captured by the full spectrum of existing empirical work. And so our method, we're going to follow this local projections method. We're going to estimate the impacts on the log levels of GDP. And importantly, we're going to allow the effects of the temperature shock to vary by initial temperature, so we can measure whether hot and cold countries are hit differently by temperature shocks. And then critically, we're really going to try to capture the dynamics here, because that's really what matters, is how much persistence is there in the impacts of a temperature shock. Okay, we're just using standard data for this exercise from the climate literature. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do in order to estimate the impacts of temperature is we're just going to construct a temperature shock, which we define as the unforecastable component of temperature in year t, given the information that was available up to year t. And so all that means is that if you regress temperature on its own lags and a fixed effect for each country, the residual from that regression is what we're going to call our temperature shock. So if you know what temperature was the last few years and you know long run average temperature in that country, you can make some prediction for t, and we're going to, for temperature in year t, and we're going to say that the prediction error for that is our temperature shock. And then we're going to look at the impulse response function of the effects of that temperature shock in year t on both temperature and on GDP. And so this is the estimating equation for temperature. And so what we're saying here is that temperature in year t plus h is going to be some function of the shock realized in t. That's the component of temperature in year t that you couldn't predict given the information available up to year t. So this is going to be a regression of temperature on the lags up to year t on this fixed effect, and the part that's orthogonal to that is this temperature shock, and then we're going to measure the effects of that temperature shock out to year t plus h. And importantly, we're going to allow these effects to differ, the effects of the lags and the effects of the temperature shock to differ by long run average temperature, this t bar, so that hot and cold countries can respond differently to temperature. Then we're just going to do the same thing for GDP. We have the shock in year 0. That's the residual from regressing temperature on a fixed effect and its own lags. And then we're going to measure the effect of that shock in year 0 on GDP in year t plus h. And of course, we're going to control for country fixed effects. And in the main specification, we control for year fixed effects and lags of GDP. The lags of GDP are important and we think have been neglected by some of the estimates in this literature. Because any impacts on GDP that are dynamic are going to want to take out whatever was happening in the GDP process up to year 0. Okay, and then the year fixed effect in our main specification controls for global trends in the global economy, but we're also going to try a specification where we replace the year fixed effect with basically the US TFP level or the OECD TFP level in order to try to allow to capture more of that persistence in temperature. That's what we really care about. So if you have the year fixed effect, then you only have idiosyncratic persistence in temperature. But if you replace that with a different control for the global economy, you might be able to capture more of the persistence in temperature that we're interested in to estimate its effects. Okay, so that's the estimation strategy. Now let me take you through the results and what we see in terms of this tremendous persistence of the impact of temperature on GDP. So to start with, this graph just shows you, very similar to what's been estimated by a variety of previous work, the impacts of a 1 degree shock to temperature in a given year on GDP per capita in that year, where we allow that impact to differ by long run country temperature. And so in hot countries, this is the hottest countries in the world are about 28C. We find that a 1 degree shock in temperature reduces GDP by about 1.5% in the year in which it's realized. And in the coldest countries, I grew up in Chicago. Diego lives in Chicago now, so we know all about this. In cold places, it's actually kind of nice when it's warmer and the economy gets like a modest bump in the very coldest. So like Sweden and Norway are around 5-6 degrees Celsius. So in the very coldest countries, you get a little bit of a bump when it's hotter than expected in a given year. In the hottest countries, you lose some. But that's just the contemporaneous effect. And what we're really interested in here is the persistence. So what was fascinating to us, and it's been a fascinating finding, I think, in this literature, is that when you look at the next year, GDP, the standard errors get a little bigger, but GDP remains almost as depressed in the hottest countries, and the effects really don't change when you look 1 year out from the shock. And when you go 2 years out, when you go 4 years out, when you go 5 years out, the shock really seems to have an incredibly persistent effect. The standard errors, of course, get a little bit bigger as you're looking with more and more lags, but the point estimates are incredibly stable for these effects of temperature on GDP, suggesting that that red line I showed you in the model part of the paper, it's not too far from the empirical truth, where when you have this transitory shock in year 0, the effects really seem to persist into the future years. And so we can see that for these hot countries, you have this bad shock in year 0, and the effect really seems to last. The same is true to some degree in colder countries that get this modest boost, this modest boost to GDP. But now we also want to show the estimating equation. We also show this estimated equation for temperature, and we also want to think, is the shock itself truly transitory, or is there some persistence to the shock? And what we found when we look at that is that especially in hot countries, the shock itself is persisting to some degree. So when it's hotter by one degree, so whatever shock exists in year 0, about 40% of that shock persists in year 1, and about 25% persists in the following few years. And so basically what this is saying is that when it's hotter than expected in year 0, for various geological reasons that I'm not an expert on, our estimates suggest that it remains hotter than expected in the years that continue, and that's especially true in hot countries, but to some degree true in middle temperature and in colder countries. And so what that means is that this GDP effect that we've estimated, it's actually not purely from a transitory shock, and that's going to be important for the interpretation. We have this tremendous persistence in GDP, but some of that persistence is resulting from the persistence of the shock itself. That is, with the information available in year 0, if temperature is higher than expected at year 0, it's also higher than expected in the few years that follow. And so some of the persistence in GDP is likely to be driven by the fact that temperature didn't actually go back to normal right away after it was hotter than expected in that given year. When you look over the 10-year horizon, it's to us, it's kind of amazing, this persistence in GDP and the persistence in temperature persists to some degree. Okay, so to give you a sense, to give ourselves a sense of the magnitudes of what this amount of persistence means in terms of what we actually care about, which is projecting the impacts of a long-run shock to temperature, we're just going to construct this very simple simulation using our stylized model to infer what is the omega parameter, or the parameter that governs persistence in our model, that could rationalize what we see in the data. So we're just going to have this simple simulation where we're going to calibrate the magnitude of a temperature shock to match the year 0 effect. And so by construction in year 0, we're going to have a shock, the shock be as large as it needs to be to match the year 0 effect in a hot country in the data. And then we're going to calibrate the path of the shock to match the path of temperature in the impulse response function. So we're going to say, through the lens of the model, what if you had a shock that was as large as the year 0 shock in our estimates, and a shock that was as persistent as the temperature persistence that we estimate in our empirical work? We're going to say, what is the omega that would rationalize the persistence in GDP that we see given this kind of shock that we've constructed in our stylized model? And what we find when we do that is that with an omega of about 0.08, you can match the impulse response function that we get for GDP pretty closely. So the red is the empirical estimate for the impulse response from a 1 degree temperature shock in year 0, the impact of GDP. And the black is in a simulation where we, by construction, have the year 0 shock match and then we have the persistence of the shock match our persistence in temperature. With an omega of 0.08, we can match the persistence of GDP. And so that's going to very conveniently be an omega that's very consistent with the omega you get from the estimates where you take our equation of motion for technology in the model to the broad country level data on TFP. We were getting something like 0.06, 0.07 for omega. So in English, what that means is that for domestic technology, global technology explains about 6 to 8% of the domestic technology evolution over time. And that's going to mean that when you have a shock to the domestic factors affecting productivity, like temperature or like human capital or anything else, but in this case, we're estimating, of course, for temperature, that can have a really long run effect on economic growth, because this degree to which the world economy tethers countries together is an important but a relatively small effect. Domestic factors matter a lot for domestic long run growth. And so what does this mean, this omega 0.08, for how we should be modeling the impacts of a permanent temperature shock on growth? This says 0.92 because we flipped the way we defined omega at some point, and I forgot to replace this graph, but this should say 0.08. And so basically what that means is that if you have a permanent shock starting in year 0 with our estimated level of persistence, we should expect that to affect growth for multiple decades into the future. But eventually to level off into a level effect, but one that's much, much larger than if you just projected that level effect. Okay, and so now I'm going to spend 5 minutes telling you about our projections. The important part is where they came from. That's why I spent most of the time on that. So to make these projections, we're just going to take the impulse response, the ratio of the impulse response of GDP to the impulse response of temperature over the 10-year horizon as our long-run level effect from a given pulse of temperature. So there's some pulse of temperature in the data. We're going to measure the total integral of the pulse to GDP and call that the GDP effect per degree of temperature. I should say, as a small caveat, that because the standard errors really blow up over time, we're going to restrict this to the 10-year effect. But our stylized model suggests that with this level of persistence, you might see actually more of a 15 to 20-year effect on GDP growth. So we might be underestimating by a bit, but it suggests we're probably underestimating by maybe 10 or 15% based on restricting it to this 10-year multiplier. And then we're just going to take our temperature projections from the standard in the literature. Then critically, we're going to allow this multiplier to vary by the initial temperature, so that there are different effects on hot and cold countries. Okay, I just have a few more slides to get through. So when you do that, just to give you an example of how our estimates are going to differ from the literature, this is the projections of GDP per capita in India throughout the course of the century across the different projection methods. So blue is just some off-the-shelf, no climate change baseline. We've done everything in logs, and so whatever the results are independent of what you assume the baseline to be. But just for the sake of argument, we take various baseline GDP growth trajectories off the shelf. The green line is what you get in India if you do just the level effect. So you just account for the contemporaneous shock and allow for no persistence of temperature effects over time. That's where you get these small effects that for many years were kind of the standard in the literature. The red line is if you allow temperature to have a permanent effect on GDP growth in India. Eventually GDP growth turns negative and India gets poorer and poorer. And the orange line is what our estimates suggest, which are several times larger than one set of estimates and several times smaller than another set of estimates. You can do this for various countries, and you can also see an important contrast is when you do this for colder countries. The permanent growth effect projections suggest that colder countries are going to shoot off past the world frontier. And so in our model-based empirical evidence, we think that kind of the frontier countries are growing together, and that if you have a really good shock to the components of technology adoption and growth in a given frontier country, that they're still not going to be able to grow way past the other countries. But if you have these permanent growth effect projections, then the colder countries kind of get permanently richer than the other rich countries over time. Whereas our estimates suggest like a modest improvement in the economies of these colder countries as they warm up. Okay, so just to put this back in your mind, what our projections look like, this is what you get with level effects. It's about 2% for the world. It's about 7% in the hardest hit countries. With the permanent growth effects, it's about 20 to 30% for the world and 80 to 90% in the hardest hit countries. With our estimates, it's about it's about 7 to 10% or 7 to 12% for the world, and about 30% in the hardest hit countries, depending on which of our specifications you choose. And so just to put these estimates all on the same slide, this is what you get for the world we showed these two different specifications, one where you use year fixed effects, one where you use a US TFP control to control for trends in the global economy. That's going to lead to some differences in our estimates, but by and large, they're going to be much larger than what you get if you just account for the level effects, and much smaller than what you get with the growth effects. And just to show you visually, this is my last slide, just to show you visually one more time how big the differences are in these estimates. This is the estimates by country using our estimates, but only accounting for the contemporaneous effect. So this level effect of temperature on GDP. This is the impact of several degrees of warming on GDP by country, by initial temperature. So in the hottest countries, that gives you something like 5, 6, 7% of damages. And when you use our estimates, you have to change the scale, because in the hottest countries, it's something like 25, 30% losses from this 3 to 4 degrees of warming. And then when you use the permanent growth effect projections, you have to change the scale again, because the impacts in the hottest countries are more on the order of 70, 80, 90%. And so those are kind of the green and the blue are kind of the prominent estimates that exist in the literature now. In this paper, we're making a case for the red, where we think that growth effects are critical based on the persistence of temperature that we see in the data. It's very likely that that future permanent changes in temperature will not just be a pure level effect and will have these long-run impacts on economic growth. But based on what we've seen about the growth process and how it works across countries and the historical record, we really think these long-run impacts on growth are not likely to be permanent impacts on growth. And that's going to matter a lot over the course of a century for these projections. And so that's how we end up with this sort of in-between set of estimates, where we're like, we think there are real, significant, important growth effects, but we don't think we should be modeling them as permanent growth effects, and that kind of lands us in between the existing literature. So that's the whole paper. I didn't pause at all to ask for questions, partially because I was just too excited and had a lot of material to cover, but now we have 15 minutes, so let's do some questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ishan. Very, very interesting work. So there are already some questions in the Q&A. So also to the attendees, if you have any further questions, please feel free to type them, and we can either unmute you or I will read them out loud. So there is a question by Stephen Secchetti, basically asking about the unit of observation. So the way I interpret the question is basically, do you want to look at entire countries or different regions within countries? I guess if I think about your framework, that would have different implications for the omegas, right? Because within a country, omega is likely to be higher than across country. So maybe that's one difference, but maybe you have further thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, I think that's critical. I think the reason to use countries as the level of observation is if you think the process of dynamics is playing out at the country level. And so if recovery from shocks is something that is affected a lot by the whole country rather than just the region that was hit, then that would be important. For example, if you have like a hurricane that hits a small part of the US, it might be the case that how those communities recover depends also on assistance from other parts of the US. And so a shock that hits the whole country might then not be well represented by a shock that hits one part of the country if there are kind of these insurance mechanisms across different parts of a country. So I think for the purposes of the dynamics, that's one reason to really want to look at the country level. Of course, you could get more precision and get a lot more data by looking at the subnational level. And there's some really great work that has done that. So there's a paper by Marshall Burke and Vincent Tanatuma that did like a really amazing data collection effort and got subnational GDP time series or panels for like tens of thousands of county level regions across the earth. And they also find like tremendous levels of persistence of the impacts of temperature. And so I think we haven't done that in this paper, but there's other work that uses subnational data and also finds kind of a lot of persistence to the impacts of temperature. Somewhat surprisingly, if you think that subnational regions might be better insured by linkages across their global economy. Like I guess in the language of the stylized model from this paper, I would expect the omega to be much higher across regions within a country because there's lots of flows, between counties relative to between countries. So in some sense, the persistence of temperature that people have found at the subnational level is even more surprising than what you find at the national level.
Oh, that's super interesting. Even though, I mean, there are quite persistent differences across different regions in countries as well. So, but yeah, maybe a bit less. Then there is another question by Gabriela Mundaka, basically ask about your more theoretical framework, in particular, why will Q not also affect Q star? We want to think of how dependent the developed world is on raw materials, oil and minerals. And this is crucial when we think about moving to renewables to address climate change.
Yeah. So I got distracted reading another question from Stephen in the chat. I just want to say about the Maldives being underwater, the growth impact being permanent. I think there's several things that are beyond the scope of our analysis, and I think this gets at multiple of them. One of them is like we're not doing sea level rise. Another one is that the future is going to get outside the full range of the historical record. And to the extent that happens, like, of course, things could happen that are outside what we see in the historical record. If some parts of the world are hot and then they become too hot to live in, or for humans to survive at all, that would certainly be a permanent growth effect. And so this is like, we're restricted to studying things that have happened before, but that's like a critical caveat. I basically think Stephen's right. And another thing is our regressions where we show that growth differences are not persistent across countries. There are some outliers in those growth differences. And so you might imagine that temperature could be a cause of some of those outliers. Like maybe temperature causes civil wars in some, or, contributes to causing civil wars in some places, and those places have permanent growth effects. And so we can't rule out that there will be some outlier places that do suffer like permanent growth effects. It just seems we think it's not kind of systematically likely to be the case. Okay, to Gabrielle.
Right. Yeah, I mean, also the health impacts, I guess. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you could look at, and also there could be limits to adaptation, I guess. As you said, I mean, maybe you can counter basically Maldives getting underwater to some degree, but at some point it's just no longer feasible to live there or to live in very hot regions. So, yeah.
Totally. So to Gabrielle's question, I think this is another critical caveat to our empirical estimates, although I think this is a caveat we can say somewhat more about empirically. And so the caveat here is basically through the lens of the stylized model, there could be an effect on Q star, which is that the global growth rate is common, so the countries are not diverging, but the global growth rate could fall in response to temperature easily through the model. That would be the case if the countries that kind of comprise the global frontier of technology are hard hit by temperature. In the estimates we have now, we're not finding big effects on the countries that are driving most of the innovation and most of the patenting and technology improvements in the world, because most of those are moderate temperature to colder temperature countries. So depending on what measure you use, how you weight technology innovation, we're finding something close to a zero on kind of the frontier countries. That's why we haven't modeled any effect on Q star, along with the fact that would be kind of like conceptually difficult to figure out how to do. But I think that's like basically totally right, that there could be a missing intercept Q star effect in these projections.
Great. Then there is another question by Bhavya Gupta, asking whether the empirical analysis incorporates anything or assumes anything about the current or future state of climate mitigation and adaptation policies.
Yeah, so basically what we're assuming here is like a close to no mitigation or a no mitigation scenario where we have lots of temperature change. So this is not meant to be like an equilibrium exercise or an optimal policy exercise. This is like how should we calibrate how bad the no policy future is? In terms of adaptation policies, I think that's a little bit harder to say because there could be some degree of adaptation policies or adaptation, not just policies, but actions baked into our empirical estimates from the historical record. People have been adapting to the shocks that they face in what we estimate in the data. And so I think some of that might be baked into the estimates, but certainly we're not doing anything where we're endogenizing future temperature change. That's like for smart people like Mike with these fancy models that have all of the components of mitigation and adaptation and damages. We're just trying to think about how to calibrate one component of those models that people like Mike and his friends write down.
Great. there is another quick question by Maynard Clark, basically asking what does this mean for today's financial strategy? So if I can like add to that, basically just wondering about policy implications. If I take your model seriously, I think what we want to do is basically to enhance these spillovers, technology spillovers that would basically mitigate these effects substantially. Like, what's your take on this?
Oh, that is like very much speaking my language. I think that's like an extremely overlooked part of the policy discussion, not just related to climate change, but related to everything. There's a really great paper recently, I think it's like by Heitor Pellegrina, about how important trade and intermediate inputs in agriculture is for agricultural productivity growth over time. That's just like one example of a random paper about technology spillovers, but I think one that's very pertinent to climate change because agriculture in poorer countries is such a big part of where climate change has really serious effects. So yeah, I think that's totally right. I think if the global economy were more interconnected, it would be more resilient to climate shocks and more resilient to shocks in general. And poorer countries would grow faster and catch up to the world frontier faster. According to a wide variety of evidence. So yeah, I mean, this is an academic seminar, so I'm not just going to pontificate about my policy views forever, but I think it's extremely not good the way we're kind of retrenching from global interconnections on average.
Yeah, no, couldn't agree more. Then there is another question by Glenn. Hi, Glenn, how is it going? Asking whether the finding of a persistent temperature shock is consistent with the physical science evidence, or basically you're just capturing persistent deviations from these trends that you're estimating? Or...
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. There's some people, I saw Tom Bear Parks on the call. He might know the answer to this question. He knows a lot about the physical science. We're not just capturing the trend because we find that temperature persistence even in the specification that has year fixed effects. So we've already taken out the trend and there's still idiosyncratic persistence of temperature shocks. My sense is that this can be explained by things like the El Nino, La Nina cycle and other sorts of physical science. I think there is a physical science basis for this. I do not know the physical science basis well enough to explain it.
That's interesting, but like from an econometric viewpoint, I think it's actually a good thing because, I mean, we think of these shocks as like persistent or permanent, so that there is some persistence in the data is good. So in effect, I mean, that's like the more plausible setting that you want to study. And so in some sense, I mean, maybe you could even run some counterfactuals where you condition on some like path for temperature and basically see how the effects play out if you do that. So
yeah. Yeah, no, that's it. Yeah, that's a good point. I saw Pascal's question about exponential impact. We did test for nonlinearities in basically the impact of shocks by initial country temperature. It really seems to be kind of surprisingly linear, where the impact of that initial shock, how it varies by temperature. But of course, you know, the temperatures, the countries that are the hottest parts of the world are going outside the historical sample. And so we don't know if it becomes nonlinear once you have to extrapolate past that.
Great. I think there are some more questions, but we're basically out of time. So maybe this is a good point to wrap up. Want to take this opportunity to thank Ishan to present here today. I think I and everybody learned a lot. And I also wanted to thank all the attendees for coming, even though it's a holiday in Europe, it's Easter Monday. So it's amazing that you guys could all make it nevertheless. And we were excited to future webinars in this series. So we haven't settled on the speaker for next month, but we will keep you posted on our socials and on the eAxis website. So looking forward to future versions of this. And thanks so much again, Ishan, and also the audience for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And people are free to should feel free to email me if they want to chat more about any of this.
Wonderful. Okay. Have a good one, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thanks, Ishan. Bye-bye.